So now little by little, everyone is going to be joining us. So I'm going to give them some seconds for the whole thing. Buenas tardes a todos. Veo que el número de estudiantes que se suman al acto va incrementando. Vamos a dar un par de segundos para que el propio programa de Zoom os vaya aceptando a todo el mundo y así cuando el número de participantes llegue a un número razonable empezamos. Demos un par de segundos para que el sistema lo gestione y empezamos, ¿de acuerdo? Sí, quizá estamos preparados para empezar. Pues vamos a ello. Buenas tardes a todos. Empiezo por lo obligatorio, me presento. Yo soy Jordi Quero, soy el director del Máster Universitario en Diplomacia y Organizaciones Internacionales del CEI International Affairs, del Centro de Estudios Internacionales de la Universidad de Barcelona. Y hoy vamos a inaugurar este nuevo ciclo ahora Mediterránea 2021-2022 con una sesión que, como veis, está con nosotros ya el profesor Ehtesham. El profesor Ehtesham, dejadme que lo presente muy rápido, él es el director del Instituto de Estudios Islámicos y de Oriente Medio de la Universidad de Durham, uno de los grandes especialistas en el análisis de la política exterior iraní. Y hoy tenemos por delante una sesión que hemos titulado Irán y los Estados Unidos, nuevos presidentes, misma historia de siempre. Esta, como veréis, es una sesión que pretende hacernos precisamente la pregunta de qué podemos esperar de las nuevas presidencias, tanto en Washington como Teherán. Por tanto, ¿qué podemos esperar del nuevo presidente Raisi y qué podemos esperar del nuevo presidente Biden en las relaciones bilaterales? Pero también abrir la discusión para cuál puede ser la nueva política exterior iraní, cuál puede ser la nueva política exterior norteamericana en el contexto post-fin del acuerdo nuclear. Por tanto, tenemos por delante una sesión de un tema de tremendísima actualidad después de las dos elecciones, la que en enero puso al presidente Biden en la Casa Blanca y la que en agosto puso al presidente Raisi en la presidencia de Irán. Y lo que vamos a hacer es, el profesor Ehtesham va a hacer una conferencia inaugural de unos 45 minutos, durante la cual vosotros podéis ir lanzando preguntas a través del chat. Los que estáis siguiendo el acto desde YouTube, también podéis hacer las preguntas a través de YouTube y nuestros compañeros nos las harán llegar. De tal forma que cuando el profesor Ehtesham acabe, yo habré compilado esas preguntas y se las podré hacer llegar y se las lanzaré. Por tanto, queremos que sea un acto participativo en ese sentido y os animo a que hagáis las preguntas al profesor Ehtesham como vosotros queráis. So moving now into English, I just said welcome to everyone. I just welcome everyone on board. I introduce you, Professor Ehtesham. And I think there is nothing else to say. I will leave the floor to you. So you'll have around 45 minutes for your whole speech, after which we are going to open up the floor for questions, comments of the students that might be channeled through myself, okay? So it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Buenos dias, everybody. It is absolutely my pleasure. First, let me begin by my apologies for not being in Barcelona in person. Which fool would give up on the opportunity to visit Barcelona? Here is the first one. I'm afraid due to COVID condition, I wasn't able to be with you. But I take this as a rain check, Jordi, and hopefully I'll be able to join you the next occasion. Also, I'd like to thank very much the two institutes and University of Barcelona for inviting me to kick off your series of lectures, the Adula Mediterranean, which is fascinating. And I look forward to following what takes place next. And it's interesting that you kick off with one of the most contentious issues that we are trying to deal with internationally. So that should be a good warning for all your students that things can only get more difficult or probably more easier from here on if we can crack this one going forward. Why is this important? Well, I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at the context of this before we look at the more recent developments, the two presidents, you know, the same old story and so on, because the package, the same old story needs to be unpacked about what is the same old story and so on. So what we need to know to begin with, that we're talking about over 40 years of animosity between these two countries. And this is confrontation which has come at great cost to both countries, I would argue. And it, you know, the lack of progress in this regard has left the region in disarray. And what is interesting is that with so many of its adversaries, United States has managed to find a modus operandi with Vietnam, with China, with Cuba even, with Venezuela, with North Korea, dialogue with no boundaries. With Iran, the two are still stuck in the very rudimentary levels of diplomatic dialogue. The American flag has not flown in Iran, and the only place where the Iranian flag has flown is in New York, the jurisdiction of the United Nations. So this is very anomalous for the great superpower to have parked a country of this size, Iran, of importance, to the side. Why have we got to a place that we have got to, right? So let me begin by asking why Iran mattered to the United States. So there are a number of reasons as to why that was the case, and I want to package them in several compartments. The first is that Iran under the Shah was the linchpin of US and American interests in the region, right? Iran was an active player in the region, in other words. It was the big brother in the so-called twin pillars that the Nixon doctrine put together, that put Iran and Saudi Arabia as the protectors, the guarantors of American Western interests. It was the largest and most effective power in the Persian Gulf, where much of the oil of the world at the time was coming from, let's remember. It was the only regional country that could mediate between the Arabs and Israel at the time. Remember, this is going back to before Camp David of 1979 that brought peace between Israel and Egypt. Before that time, Iran was the only country that had the assurances of the Israelis, as well as the assurances of Israel's neighbors in Egypt and in Jordan and others. So it could function, if you like, as a good officer in that context. The only country, I'll submit, in the region which could do that at the time. Iran was supporter of the region's emerging monarchies in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Bahrain, and so on. All these countries that were coming out from the British withdrawal from the Persian Gulf. And also, Iran was the bulwark power against the Arab nationalist states of Egypt, of Iraq, of Syria, of Libya, and so on. All those countries which had lined up, if you like, against the so-called moderate monarchical forces in the Arab world. Iran was very much seen as the protector, as the supporter of all these regimes. But also, Iran was the backbone of OPEC. OPEC, for those who don't remember, OPEC, they should remember, is very much in the frame now, with oil prices running at over $85 a barrel. It's still about oil. It's still about OPEC. But in the 70s, Iran was the cheerleader of OPEC, but also at that time, it was OPEC's largest producer and exporter of oil. Iran could pump 10 million barrels of oil a day by the mid-1970s, outpacing Saudi Arabia, which caught up with Iran later in that time. So not only was it the backbone of OPEC, it was also a largest producer and also a major oil state. To this day, Iran has the second largest natural gas deposits in the world, which remain largely untapped thanks to sanctions and revolution and so on. Beyond this also, Iran was very much an active player on the world stage. The Shah was a Cold War warrior. Iran sat on the front line between the West, NATO, and the East, Warsaw Pact. Iran neighbored the Soviet Union, the only American ally to directly border the Soviet Union at the time. Iran, therefore, was a so-called frontline neighbor at the state, an ally of the United States. Iran was an emerging power in its own right, which had friendly relations with all the Warsaw Pact countries. Iran had very good relations with Romania, for example, with Poland, with Hungary, with Czechoslovakia, with East Germany, and of course the Soviet Union itself, but also with such Asian countries as India and Japan. And Iran established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1971, the same year that the US established this. So it was a country that could throw its weight about regionally, but also speak to grander issues internationally. It was a major military power in its own right, but it had built up its military base through close cooperation with Western, American, British, French, Spanish, Italian, German arms suppliers throughout the 1970s, and its shared intelligence links with all of these countries, which of course were of paramount importance at the height of the Cold War. And to add more to, if you like, weight of this, Iran was also the MENA region's largest and fastest growing market economy. This was a country on the move. If you look at the Republic of Korea, South Korea today, and look at it as being such a major international economy, well, put Iran in the same context as South Korea in 1976, 1977. That was Iran's trajectory, according to the World Bank, that this is going to be an emerging economy in its own right. So it had regional as well as major international weight. But also from the American perspective, it was ruled by a secular, Western educated, modernizing monarch who had ample power at his disposal. He was not under threat regionally or domestically throughout this period till the late 1970s. But the Achilles heel in this beautiful relationship was that the monarchy had become a one-stop shop for addressing all of America's post-Vietnam regional problems, right? It was heavily pro-US. It was heavily US armed and trained. It shared the US's vision of regional security. It had warm, good, or correct relations with virtually every regional state. And it paid for all of its arms imports himself. In other words, he didn't need to rely on American taxpayer donations to import American arms, which was a critical issue after Vietnam, of course, because of the costs of the Vietnam War, because of rising inflation in the United States, and because of pressures on the US dollar. Here is a country that says, you know what, we'll pay top dollar for anything and everything that you can produce militarily. For Nixon, this was a gift made in heaven. What this meant, therefore, was the United States could refrain from active armed involvement in a region like the Middle East and leave regional security to its partners, in this case, Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's no brainer to see why the US relied on Iran at that time. So moving on from this then, let's ask the question, why did the 79 Islamic Revolution in Iran matter? What did it do? Let's run down a short list of these. Firstly, because it's dismantled profoundly, fundamentally, US's regional security architecture. Basically, when we talked about two pillars in the 1970s, what Iran, the revolution did was take the big pillar out, but also poke the other pillar into instability at the same time. Why did it matter? Because it caused an earthquake in the regional order. Why did it matter? Because it disrupted the region's geopolitical balance of power. Why did it matter? Because it fundamentally altered Iran's own role in the region and its position in the region. So overnight, for example, Iran changed from being a pro-Israeli Muslim country to an anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian Muslim country. Think about the huge impact of such a sudden transition in the state's behavior. Why did it matter? Because it created the region's first truly revolutionary state. Because it created the region's first truly Islamist regime. and also because it created the region's first truly revolutionary Shia regime. And if that isn't enough, because post-revolutionary regime moved into a strong anti-American, anti-status quo regime in the region. Iran was by this time, by 1980, trouble for the United States. The Iranian Revolution, therefore, turned the US's regional policies into complete chaos. It raised the United States security commitments to the region directly. It increased America's military engagements in the region. It raised America's security presence in the region. And it multiplied the security dilemmas that the US faced in the region. How all of this happened and in what form? Well, cast your mind back to what Iran and the Shah actually did and represented for the United States. So without the twin pillars, the US had to be more actively engaged in the region. But not just that. When Iran turns anti-status quo, anti-American, the US has to commit its own resources, its own security, military, economic resources to stabilize the region, but also to protect its allies from Iranian aggressive behavior. Iran regime had changed, but Iran's abilities, its size, its influence had not. So it had to be checked. But also, America had to be conscious of a sudden rise in its security presence. Thus far, it had managed to offshore its interests, protection to others. With the Iranian Revolution, it had to be actively involved in protecting its interests, but also to be seen to protecting its allies. Its allies felt vulnerable to pressure of Iran, but also felt vulnerable to revolutionary forces that Iran was now pushing out in different directions. Why were the Americans concerned about this particular revolution above all? Clearly, there are a whole list of reasons that I've already stated, but also there were more personal reasons, if you want to call it that. First, Iran was the first country to take American diplomats hostage for not agreeing with America's behavioral policies in the region. That was a great anathema to the great superpower. Secondly, here was a small state, relatively speaking, which was directly challenging US's presence in this region. Thirdly, Iran was directly and indirectly challenging US's allies. Ayatollah Khomeini used to call Saudi Arabia's regime referred to as American Islam. Iran fought an 8-year war with Iraq. Iraq was not an American ally, but Iraq stood against the Iranian Revolution, for which Americans poured in support for the Iraqi regime, the Saddam Hussein regime at the time. Americans had to rush to aid Israel as Iran's anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist propaganda began to reach a pitch high in the 1980s and beyond. So the challenges, both direct and indirect to American allies, was a challenge that America had to confront by itself. Iran had also contributed to the region's insecurity through terrorism and use of violence, whether this was in Lebanon, the infamous tragedy of bombing of the American barracks in Beirut that Hezbollah, Iran's proxy, had conducted, whether it was strategies that were contrary to US's interests in the region, and also, last but not least, for the American public in particular, the agony of watching the symbol of Americanism, namely the American flag, being burnt on a daily basis on television, and for Iranians to trample all over the Star and Stripes on a daily basis at every opportunity. This was an affront to America's self-belief. And this was the only country that had made this into a virtue of its public diplomacy. And Americans just were baffled and bewildered by this behavior that Iran was portraying. what this did, therefore, this whole set of relationships and interactions was bring the two countries into a cycle of distrust, misunderstanding, confrontation, and of course, sometimes violence. So despite many instances of relative convergence of interests, these would be over Iraq's occupation of Kuwait in 1990, for example, where both Iran and the United States wanted the Iraqis to be evicted from Kuwait, whether this was in early 1990s in Bosnia, where both the Clinton administration and the Iranian presidency wanted to protect the Bosnian Muslims, where Iranians clandestinely worked with the Americans to protect the Bosnians against the Serbs, whether this was in Afghanistan jihad in the 1980s against the Soviet Union, where Iran was supporting the Shia militias against the Soviet occupying forces, while Saudi Arabia was supporting the Sunni militias against the Soviet occupying forces, that there was convergence of interests, whether it was in 9/11, where both Iran and the United States saw Al-Qaeda as a direct threat to the security of their people, whether it was against the Taliban, where both Iran and the United States saw the Taliban as a negative influence, as a dangerous force emerging in Afghanistan, whether it was against Islamic State, where both United States and Iran have seen Islamic State as a danger, as a direct threat to their interests in the region, and more broadly about Salafism. Despite all these instances of relative convergence of interest that we can identify, and also attempts at dialogue between them as well, whether it is the so-called dialogue of civilizations that President Khatami of Iran presented, whether it is through the JCPoA, the nuclear agreement of 2015, whether it is Iran's offering of a grand bargain in 2003 to the United States. Despite these rhythms of dialogue as well, I would argue the electoral cycles in the two countries, regional crises, as well as disruptions in the behavior of policy of other states, have all come to disrupt any emergence of any pattern that would lead to a direct or indeed indirect dialogue between Tehran and Washington that would facilitate the presence of a framework for them to begin to address many of these core structural issues. And so you find that both parties have been at fault over the years. Looking at Iran's clandestine operations have hurt the United States. Iran's use of violence and terrorism against its opponents, and others indeed, in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, and so on, have been seen by the US as a very disruptive behavior. Iran's nuclear program has bugged the United States since the 1993-1994 period, when evidence began to emerge of Iran wanting to restart its nuclear program in cooperation with Russia, in cooperation with China, and also military engagements with North Korea as well. There has been concerns about Iran's development of surface-to-surface missiles as part of its so-called asymmetrical defense strategy. And also there is continuing concern in the US public opinion, as well as in the US administration and political system about Iran's anti-Israeli position. And of course, Iran's so-called axis of resistance, which is posited as opposition to all of Americans' interests in the region, also remains very much at the forefront of American concerns. If these are concerns about Iran on the one hand, on the other hand, the Iranians have concerns, legitimate concerns themselves about the US. The US put Iran as an outlaw nation to give it the phrase that it was used during the Clinton presidency in 1993. The same president put Iran as part of his dual containment of Iran and Iraq in the 1990s, right up to 2001 when President Bush took over. When President Bush took over, following 9/11 in 2002, he made his State of Union address in which he made this famous phrase of Iran, North Korea, and Iraq were part of the so-called axis of evil that needed to be confronted and rolled back. To Iranians, this was a shocking attack on its identity. And of course, President Bush's rejection of Iran's grand bargain, that we put everything on the table, we normalized relations. That was delivered to the Americans through the good offices of the Swiss mediators, and I gather the letter never reached President Bush's table. And Iran took that as a slap in the face. This interaction, this mistimed tango, if you like, has fed mistrust. The relationship then has become a victim of domestic political cycle of each country. When one of them turns reformist, the other one turns conservative. It's ironic. The relationship has been victim of abuse of disruptive forces in each country. When Obama pushes ahead with JCPoA, Trump opposes it and he becomes president. When Rafsanjani, Khatami, Rouhani try to push for a dialogue, a bomb goes off, somebody is killed somewhere, and evidence of new enrichment resources suddenly appears in the media. But also, the region has been vulnerable to regional dynamics and exposed to the interests of other regional actors and international players. That is because direct line between the two has been absent. The relationship has become hostage of these four factors: the electoral cycle, the role of domestic disruptors, regional crises, and interests of other international and regional actors. The two parties cannot find a way out of this quagmire that they've been stuck in. So the drivers of identity politics, Americans feel threatened by the way Iran treats them. Iranians feel threatened and abused by the way the Americans treat them. But identity politics is now very much part and parcel of this misjudged relationship. But also the other driver of perception of self and perception of the other. To the Americans, everything Iran stands for is anathema. To the Iranians, everything America stands for is anathema. And this reinforces their own self-identity, self-belief, self-perception of their right and their might. Which then leads to the third driver of this misguided, if you like, disjointed relationship, and that is fear. Fear appears in the absence of understanding, in the absence of dialogue, and the absence of contact. Iranians have very little contact directly with each other. They understand each other indirectly, and they have no means of direct communications either. Even JCPoA was a product of Omani mediation in 2013-12, before we got to the point that we did. So fear also causes paralysis. There is fear of engagement on the one hand, but there's also fear of confrontation. Neither is conducive to building a space for dialogue and understanding and so on. But these three drivers of identity politics, of perception and fear have been compounded by the sense of opportunities missed. Both countries are painfully aware of the efforts that they have made to try and address this open wound for both of them. And are very conscious that they cannot continue to invest their own legitimacy and domestic capital on something that continues to go wrong. Secondly, there are regional barriers to compromise. There are countries who fear that if the Americans cut a deal with Iran, their situation will be worsened, or that their position as close American allies will be weakened. And thirdly, the countries are now hostage to changing international conditions, which is impacting relations as well. Britain has left the EU, so we can no longer talk about the EU3, for example, right? Which is directly impacting the European powers' ability to influence the dialogue or the absence of dialogue between the US and Iran, because there isn't that powerful, strong European voice, which included a permanent member of the Security Council, which also sat at the table of the European Union Council. These have impact at the international level, folks. So let me quickly now, to put both sides' gripes and concerns on the scales, they would look something like this. For the Americans, Iran is an epitome of terrorism. This is, to many of them, a terror state par excellence. It is a cause of instability in the region. It is a relentless pursuer of weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear program, that America feels responsible in keeping an eye on to try and keep Iran away from nuclear weapons. Iran is now a purveyor of strategic missile systems that could one day carry nuclear warheads. That is of major concern to the United States. But on top of this, Iran continues to threaten its allies with its ballistic missiles, but also alongside this, it has developed a sophisticated mechanism of mobilizing its proxies wherever it wants them, of using drones, technology that it initially got from the drone that it knocked out of the sky, the American drone that it knocked out of the sky, and also its powerful cyber security attacks. So there are serious levels at which the United States sees Iran as a dangerous adversary. For the Iranians, they fear a whole gamut of things that America could do to them. The most obvious is invasion. There was a time in 2002 and 3 that in Washington, the conversation was, now that Iraq is taken, let's turn right and go to Iran. Yeah, Iranians haven't forgotten that the neocons are still out there, and they saw them be resurrected around Trump again. Somebody like Bolton, who had always been an advocate of regime change, appears at the front seat of the Trump administration. That sends alarm bells in Iran. But also, if they don't invade, they can use airstrikes. If they don't use airstrikes, they can allow Israel to use airstrikes. They can disrupt Iran by assassinations. We've seen so many of them, both in Iran and in Iraq, of course. Qasem Soleimani is the classic example of that. They can pressure Iran through persuasion. If that doesn't work, through containment. If that doesn't work, through regime change. And if that doesn't work, through what Ayatollah Khamenei himself fears, particularly, is a velvet revolution. So Iranians feel that America has so many weapons in its toolkit that it cannot afford to let its guard down for a minute. So what now? How do we square this circle? And Jordi, I know you want me to stop, so I'll proceed to Raisi, the new president, and Biden, the other new president. Ibrahim Raisi is close to Ayatollah Khamenei, who for the first time has lined up his conservative ducks in line. He has a conservative president, he has a conservative parliament, he has a conservative National Security Council, all of them his allies, all of them singing from the same hymn sheet that he has been singing along all this time. So while previous presidents like Khatami, like Rouhani, like Rafsanjani, or even Ahmadinejad were not of his liking, this guy is. He hasn't got an independent base, so he's beholden to Ayatollah Khamenei. He's an ultra-conservative who owes all of his positions to Ayatollah Khamenei. He leads a cabinet of hardliners who have been handpicked by himself and Ayatollah Khamenei. He is close to the Revolutionary Guard, but also to the security establishment. He prioritizes China and Russia and the East over the West. He will not accept JCPoA 2.0. And he demands end of sanctions now before JCPoA can be introduced. These are very different conditions to what was before 2021. Biden, on the other hand, made an election commitment to return to the JCPoA. Biden is weakened by everything that Trump did with Iran, in the region, and internationally. Biden has continuously made compromises to make any of his strategies with Iran work. So his hand is weak. He's pressured by his European allies on the one hand to push ahead with JCPoA. He's pressured by his regional allies on the other hand to stop from pushing ahead with JCPoA. He's unable to build trust with Russia and China to push through any opportunities for dialogue. He is unable to provide the Islamic Republic with any incentives to bring them back to the table. He is constantly under pressure from Trumpites in Congress, in the media, and within public opinion. He can't lift sanctions without re-entering JCPoA, and yet he cannot enter JCPoA until JCPoA 2.0 is met. What is that? That Iran ends terrorism, Iran puts its ballistic missile program on the table, and that Iran declares all of its nuclear sites to IEA before JCPoA comes to power. So we are stuck, if you like, between the rock and the hard place. And yet the irony of this 40-odd years of history is that right now, JCPoA is the only mechanism for dialogue that we have. And Vienna is the only place on earth that we can have even indirect dialogue between the two parties. We need the JCPoA to bring Iran's nuclear program fully under IEA control. We need JCPoA to limit Iran's enrichment activities. We need JCPoA to prevent Iran experimenting with nuclear explosives. These are givens. But also, JCPoA is the basis for trying to change the bilateral narrative, what President Obama was trying to do before he left office. It is the only mechanism that can help us to reduce regional tensions. And it's the only mechanism that can bring Iran into a framework of regional dialogue, which will finally release American forces from this region and help them eventually to pivot to Asia. So everything, it seems to me, is now hostage to a disrupted mechanism that President Trump foolishly threw down the well, that no wise man and woman seems able to take out of the well. I think I have abused your hospitality. I'll stop now and very much look forward to questions and comment.
Thank you so much. You were perfectly on time, so that was great. You don't have to worry about this. Thank you so much for your whole speech. It has been really useful to fully understand what's going on and what can we expect in the upcoming future. Students are starting to ask their questions through the chat. I feel that I might start by asking my own questions, so I'm gonna let them a little bit more time if they are willing to add some questions to the chat. And I have some different questions about some issues that you mentioned that I would like you to, if possible, if you could further talk about. Number one, about the potential upcoming change of Supreme Leader. It seems that the time for this is obviously naturally approaching. it seems that this might trigger some kind of overall generational change after the passing away of many of the leaders. And it seems that especially after the passing of Rafsanjani, it's difficult to find all the old big boys from the revolution to take the position of Khamenei. I would like to hear your opinion in that respect, and specifically to what extent we see the Pasdaran, the Revolutionary Guard, gaining some leverage thanks to this upcoming change, especially, as you said, as in a time where the Majlis also is highly conservative. So how those three things combined together might talk about the upcoming future or the upcoming years in Iran. Number one. Number two, my second question is about obviously the future of the JCPoA. Number one, number two, whatever we call it. Do you feel that these kind of US prerequisites that you mentioned could be met in any possible way by Iran, or this is something that automatically transforms this as a no game for all the players involved? And finally, my third question in that respect. I have to share with you that when we were designing the topic of today's session, we thought about including a third novelty in the region, a third new president in the region, and this is Naftali Bennett. So we do not only have a new president in Washington and in Iran, in Tehran, but also in Tel Aviv. To what extent the convergence of all these new leadership, especially the one in Tel Aviv, can play a role in everything that you said so far? While you are answering, as I said, I'm gonna keep on compiling the students' questions, and in a minute I'm gonna share them with you. So the floor is yours, obviously, Anush.
Oh, excellent! Thank you very much for those very easy questions. Supreme Leader, yeah, you're right. You know, when any assertive, long-standing assertive leader passes, the dynamics change. Inevitably, the dynamics change. And Ayatollah Khamenei is very conscious of this. That is why he has manipulated to manufacture a lineup of forces that when he goes in Parliament, in the Assembly of Experts, in the Guardian Council, in the presidency, in other words, in the cabinet, in the judiciary, everybody is handpicked in many ways, or is sympathetic in all ways with his agenda. But that doesn't mean that it'll go smoothly, because if in a position like that, you actually stifle that competition. And the competition, we know, in authoritarian states emerges once the leader is gone. If you haven't watched the movie The Death of Stalin,
very good one.
Watch it, because
very good recommendation.
that tells you exactly what happens.
Perfect.
when a dictator passes, when that transition begins to take place. And in Iran, it can go in so many different directions. It could lead at one extreme, the abolition of the supreme leader system completely, or the other extreme, the militarization of the supreme leader. On the other hand, and in between, you can have a weak supreme leader that the IRGC, Revolutionary Guard, hold up. You could have a supreme leader that buys his way through patronage and through force, that he uses the oppressive wing of the state to stop all challenge at once in the system. Or you might get the X factor. From Najaf, voices could come that would challenge Iran's right to supreme leadership. That Hezbollah might change leadership and change relationship with the Iranian security establishment. That things outside of Iran could then converge and affect Iran, because Iran's revolutionary regime has ensured that it is enmeshed with these forces outside the state, which also have an inverse influence on Iran itself. So these are things that we cannot predict, but can certainly come as features of a post-Khamenei environment. So, and of course, you know, his passing could lead to strike and major uprisings that either the regime will have to put down by brutal force or has to compromise with. So these scenarios are all live, and it is very interesting to see what happens when the supreme leader does pass. And I agree with you. His advanced age means that, you know, this is an inevitability that probably in Rais's term it'll have to be confronted, right? Future of JCPoA. I think what's going on in Vienna right now is so important because both Europeans and Iranians are talking down obstacles, and both sides are talking up opportunities. That is a good vibe, positive vibe coming out of Vienna, for the simple reason it means they haven't thrown the opportunity for dialogue out the window. And there are good reasons for this, because Iran's economy is now on its knees, because Iran needs the lifting of sanctions. And they know that Biden cannot do it without some Iranian offer. They know Biden's hands are tied, and they know that they'll have to throw some lamb into this slaughterhouse before the Americans can legitimately come round to the table. But also for the other side, Biden is desperate to move beyond Iran. Biden, remember, has been around from when Carter was the president. Democrats have been carrying the cross of the Iran Revolution on their backs throughout all of this period, from Carter to Clinton to Obama and now to Biden. This president is dealing with Iran in a very different world environment, and he wants to put this to bed in his first term now, so they can move up with other immensely important regional Asian international agendas. So he needs this to work as well. And both Iran and Washington recognize the other's interests and needs. What they need is for a formula that would allow them to sell this to their home constituencies and save face while they're at the same table together. During Obama, we had the Javad Zarif and John Kerry chemistry. My concern is that the Iranian side does not offer that suave engagement with their American counterparts. Yeah. You're looking at the list that I gave you of Raisi's allies, none of these guys have much regard for the US interests or US position, and they're pushed in that mindset by both Russia and China, right? Yep. That dynamic is different from what it was before. So in that sense, you know, the obstacles remain great. And so we have to wait and see whether the balance of interest overweighs the balance of obstacles for both countries to find a way forward. Because Iran cannot survive without the lifting of sanctions, and Biden cannot move on without the end, without the re-entry into the JCPoA. And Naftali Bennett is a fascinating curveball which has come into the system. But interestingly, unlike Netanyahu, Bennett is not that keen to go to war with Iran. That is really interesting, that actually his chemistry is, we've got to work with the Americans. We've got to get the Arabs mobilized rather than do this unilaterally. Netanyahu, for him, this was like a personal wound going back to the 1990s, and that he needed to settle this score. And he was fearful of everything that was going on. Bennett can take comfort in relations with UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, to come with Sudan, dialogue with the Saudis about Iran, and open links with Russia, links with China, presence in Azerbaijan, and so on. That he's less fearful of having to deal with Iran in isolation.
Yeah.
And for him, if JCPoA 2.0 actually does lead to weakening Iran's nuclear program, the rest of it he thinks he can manage with the force of his alliances that are being built around Iran. So in that sense, it's less of a wild card than it was under Netanyahu, I would say.
Great. I got the impression after everything that you said that in a way still we are paying the price for, and this is obviously my opinion, we're still paying the price of the Soleimani assassination in a way. There are many actors within the Iranian system that are not in that position that you're talking about to engage in a meaningful way, especially after the assassination and what it meant for the overall, especially security system, but the overall political system in Iran. So I'm going to throw to you some of the questions that our students have posed thanks to the chat. If you feel like it, I have arranged them thematically. So there are so many students asking about the US sanctions. They are asking different questions about them. They are asking about whether or not if you feel that they are working, whether or not you feel that the Iranian leadership feels that they are working. Some students are asking if the US has initiated any sort of review process on the success of sanctions as a foreign policy tool, whether or not they feel that they are working or not, and as such, reconsidering them. And also the impact that especially Chinese purchase of Iranian oil is having over this sanction, whether or not they are countering those sanctions. So several questions on the very same topic, and I think that is worth to stop here for a second and to assess a little bit the impact and what are the impressions in Washington and in Tehran or on their effectiveness.
Yeah, excellent set of questions. I think from the American perspective, the sanctions are working because they have weakened Iran's economy. But from American sanctions, the sanctions are not working because they have not stopped the nuclear program, because they've accelerated Iran's nuclear program, because they've accelerated Iran's building up ballistic missiles, because they've accelerated Iran's involvement in the region, and because they've accelerated Iran's shift towards China and Russia. So it depends what the American bits of America mean by sanctions working. Right? For the Iranians, the official position is the sanctions are not working, that they are a legitimate tool, that this is an illegal imposition on Iran's sovereignty, and that Iran is doing very well on the sanctions. Thank you so much. So you can keep the sanctions or lift them, it's your choice. But they are hurting Iran on so many levels that Iran does need to find a way out of the sanctions. There is absolutely no question about this. And when the guard is down in Tehran, many will admit that the sanctions are crippling the economy and very much limiting Iran's ability to do any normal trade and investment relationships that the rest of the world takes for granted. So it's very isolating position. Do Americans reflect on sanctions as a weapon of diplomacy? Not at policy level. If anything, they continue to use it even more intensively. You know, look at Russia. Every day there are more sanctions. Look at North Korea. Every opportunity there are more sanctions. The only place where they're hesitant is China, where they go a bit, but then they stop and reconsider what they've done. But wherever there are Myanmar, another one, there are sanctions. Where there seems to be a crisis, the weapon of choice seems to be, let's impose sanctions and then we'll decide what to do. But sanctions acquire a dynamic of their own, they acquire a life of their own. And it's then very difficult to pursue other avenues of dialogue and diplomacy when you've gone to this maximalist position of isolating the country through economic, political, diplomatic, and other tools in isolating them and in sanctioning them. So yeah, I don't see it being removed as a tool in the toolkit for the foreseeable future. Again, Venezuela is another good example of this. In terms of China, Iran, the Americans have been reluctant to cut off all of Iran's oil exports. Partly part of some of America's allies desperately need oil. Korea and Japan are good examples of this.
Definitely.
India is another good example of this. But also with China, the Americans do not fight over Iran with China. They want to do it, if they have to, over other things. So they've decided to kind of turn the other way when the oil has gone to China's markets. But it's not so much American pressure that limits Iranian-Chinese oil trade. It is actually pressure from the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. It's the other countries who export oil to China that see this as a challenge to their markets. And so they are the ones who go tut-tut when news of China's increasing oil imports from Iran comes up. And of course, what does China do? It immediately increases oil imports from Saudi Arabia and UAE, which then reduces Iranian oil exports. So the Chinese are able to manipulate this, but they're not so much worried about the American pressure, but rather the pressure of the regional countries, most of whom, ironically, of course, allied with the United States. So in some ways, America seems to have an indirect influence in what's going on here.
Makes total sense. Great. So there are some other set of questions that we could include them under the label of, under a label on the changes on the neighborhood and the impact that they might have on bilateral Washington-Tehran relations. There's a question about how the changes in Syria, and specifically changes of power of the Assad regime after the war, amid the war, might have an impact of this weakening of the axis of resistance, and to what extent this talks about a new capability of Iran vis-a-vis the rest of the actors in the region. Some of the questions are about the changing nature of the GCC and the internal GCC internal changes among GCC members. And especially they are asking about Saudi Arabia. That's kind of the elephant in the room. We haven't talked much about Saudi Arabia here today. So to what extent changes, internal and domestic changes, Mohammed bin Salman and co are making of Riyadh a more unpredictable actor, and to what extent this might also be a factor to take into consideration. And finally, in that very same token, they're asking about the impact of the situation in Afghanistan. So to what extent all those three things together, so Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Afghanistan, might have an impact over the bilateral relations between the United States and Iran.
Yeah, another excellent set of observations. With Syria, the perception, and I would put Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon in the same basket, that Iran's influence is great, huge, and growing. And that it has its tentacles in Palestine, in Lebanon, in the Levant, in Syria, Arabian Sea, Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, oil state Iraq next door, and so on, and that it is somehow, dominant. But it's also true, though, that all of these are what in America they will call lemon states. These are all weak actors, right? The Soviet Union, under its International, committed itself to supporting all sorts of crumbling establishments at great cost to itself, and eventually leading to invasion of a neighbor to just keep the Communist Party from tearing itself apart. That was the case in Afghanistan in 1978. They went in there because the communists were killing each other rather than any grand strategic vision of the Soviets. Put Iran in that same position. The Houthis can never win the Yemen war. Hezbollah can never dominate Lebanon. Palestine can never be independent without Israeli acquiescence. Syria will never be whole without Arab acceptance. Iraq will never be independent so long as Iran's Shias influence Iraq and don't let it become an independent state in its own right, to emerge more powerful, more independent, more sovereign, and so on. Which means that in each case, Iran has to carry the burden of power in these countries.
Yeah, right.
To keep the axis of resistance going, it cannot afford for Assad to fall. So it has to continue to pour resource into Syria. To keep Hezbollah as its most powerful proxy present in the region, from Afghanistan to Syria and Yemen and so on, it needs to make sure that the Lebanese state doesn't fall apart. And yet it cannot guarantee the Lebanese state's stability as things stand. In Iraq, it cannot be seen to be too close to the establishment while there is so much resistance to Iran's influence in Iraq. Yeah. So in all of these cases where you would see, the Soviet flag, in this case the Iranian flag, you could also see underneath it is hollow, that there isn't actually much substance that is keeping these afloat. And all it takes is one sideways attack on one or more of them, and then the whole edifice could crumble. Which brings me nicely onto Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia could be just that catalyst, where through Mohammed bin Salman and his much more assertive, bold diplomacy, can either co-opt Iran or continue to force Iran into isolation. Because this guy's managed to build an extensive machinery of alliances and relationships. It is true that Saudi Arabia is weak in Yemen, but don't forget Saudi Arabia is not alone in Yemen. And it can continue to rely on allies to bail it out if all the chips are down in Yemen, right? Iran has only got the Houthis and nobody else. And similarly with Afghanistan, while some in Tehran celebrated American withdrawal, many bemoaned American withdrawal because they knew what that meant. What that meant is, as we'll see, the bombing of Shia mosques 3 Fridays in a row. What we see is Taliban putting pressure on the Hazaras. What we see is acceleration in narcotics trade to Iran, which is already has caused 3, 4, 5 million addicts over the years in young Iranians in Iran itself. And it means insecurity for Iran. So some in Iran are very unhappy that Americans left the way they did, while the banner sees this as the final withdrawal of America from its bastions of power in the region and a victory for Islam and Islamic revolution. In practice, it comes at huge cost that Iran is very worried about it having to pay going forward.
Yeah, makes total sense, definitely. Let me share with you the final question, the final student's question, that I think it's pretty normal that we address this issue at once. And this is about the European Union and whether or not the European Union can do more, could do more for the survival of the JCPoA in whatever form we think about, whether or not we Europeans, the European Union as such, can do something to improve, to smooth relations between the US and Iran.
Yeah, another excellent question. Thank you. Unfortunately, Europe's record card has been blotted in Tehran, because EU started with great bluster in 2016-17 when Trump was talking about this, and then when he was in office started behaving in the way that he was going to tear up JCPoA. And Brussels and Paris and Berlin and Madrid and Rome were very vocal in disagreeing with the Americans, in condemning the Americans in pulling out of JCPoA, and also at the same time in promising Iran an alternative mechanism to maintain trade, investment, dialogue, exchange, and so on. And the Iranians believe the Europeans that actually, you know what, they're going to deliver on this. And unfortunately, Europe didn't deliver for many good reasons, because Iran is small fry in the much bigger dynamic that we were dealing with, which also, of course, included Brexit at the time, that was taking up so much of attention in Brussels, in London, in Paris, and Berlin, and Madrid, and Rome, and elsewhere as well. So Europe took its eye off the ball, and Iranians were not really fussed about what was going on in Europe. They wanted the Europeans to stand up against the Americans in ways that they had said they would do. And they didn't. The irony is that there is precedent for very good European involvement, which goes back to 2003, when Europeans negotiated what became known as the Paris Accords, that were revolutionary. Europe promised Iran that it would do everything it could to make Iran a member of the world.
What's the space? Yeah, I know what you mean. Sorry.
They promised Iran that they would introduce into the region a security framework that would guarantee Iran's interests. They promised Iran investment in its nuclear program to help it build nuclear infrastructure. World Trade Organization is what I meant.
Exactly. Sorry, the WTO.
They promised Iran support for its military buildup, will you believe it or not? And they promised Iran negotiations to provide security guarantees. These are extraordinary. And you know what? Both sides agreed to the Paris Accords. And they failed because of the cycle of diplomacy and because of revelations about Iran's nuclear program that we are here. So European countries themselves are also suspicious that how much can we really invest in Iran when we know that it can do stuff behind our back? And that was with a good guy. That was under Khatami, right? How do we trust this guy who doesn't know us, who's not interested in us, and he's shown no track record of dialogue, engagement, and diplomacy in the first place? So in that sense, there isn't much for Europe to gain materially from this. And if they do step up, it'll be because they want to get something out of the Americans for this, right? And they know that Biden is keen for this. So there may be momentum that will be built in Vienna, but I can't see EU mediating in the ways that it had done before to get Iran and United States around the same table.
Sadly, it seems really true. So let me ask the final question, and this is my own personal question. Anush, let me ask you, how positive are you about the future? So are you positive or not about the future, or on what we can expect in the upcoming years? How do you feel about it?
I'm not positive about Iran's future, to be candid with you, because its society's fracturing big time. That 80+ million people who look ahead of them and they don't see any prospects for improvement, for positive change. And that is partly because of the crushing impact of sanctions that it's had. And also sanctions domestically in any country harden the arteries of power. So regimes feel insecure. Look at Venezuela, look at North Korea, look at Russia, look at Cuba, look at Iran, where sanctions are imposed. The governing elites become much more paranoid, and it kind of securitizes social relations. And Iran is in that very same place where even this government of President Raisi is symbolic of that securitization of the state and civil state relations. That doesn't bode well for the future, in my view. And also, the irony is that Iran will eventually come out of this hellhole when the world will no longer want its oil. And so, having lost 40 years of opportunity for capital and accumulation, development, and diversification, when the world no longer wants its oil, or it wants it in much smaller quantities, it's got nothing else to give the world. What happens to 85, 90, 95 million people then? So my prognosis is very kind of downbeat.
Okay.
But ultimately, though, the people there, going back to the passing of the supreme leader, the people will want to see change. And even now, this is now in this sixth cycle of presidencies, we are still stuck with bearded old men running the state. This is now second, third generation of Iranians experiencing the Islamic Republic with no young, familiar tone coming out of the state. And I suspect with the passing of the leader, that will change. And that could well be the catalyst for a reorientation, if not a positive development coming out of the place.
Great. So with this final assessment by Professor Ehtesham, I think that we can stop here today. Anush, it has been a great pleasure to have you here. I'm sure that everyone has learned a lot, as we have done. It has been an honor to have you here in this kickoff meeting, in this kickoff conference, of the IEMed of this year. For the students, as you know, next week we're going to have the second session. So I really encourage you to check the website of IEMed. And thank you by IEMed, thank you by the FEI International Affairs for all your participation. And obviously, thank you very much for Anush for sharing with us all his expertise today. Thank you so much. I hope next time we will see you here in Barcelona live, or maybe we can go to Durham.
No, I'm desperate for a nice meal in Grand Palace. So I'll be, and the Ramblas is definitely somewhere that I would love to visit with you and all your students. May I say thank you very much for inviting me and apologizing again for not being there in person with you. I've immensely enjoyed the occasion. And all I can say is, with me as the first one, the bar can only go higher from here on. So you know
that this is not true. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Anush. Thank you to everyone. Indeed. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, guys.
Take care. Take care.